So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here with you for many reasons. Because it's a time to go from being a seeker to being a finder, as I was expressing in some of the groups this morning, of seeking community, seeking being part of a group of practitioners that I feel akin to and like-minded, and I found them. So I'm so excited to be here. And when Siraj invited me to come to this conference about 5 days ago, I believe, it was a call. I heard it as a call to do some emergent learning, like Heidi was explaining us. So to be, in a way, a systems thinker about the containers in my life that I interact in, and find the systemic snapshot and the thread, the inner thread. So for me, the inner thread that I found was the theme of forgiveness, which is what I want to talk to you right now. So as some of you may know, Colombia is going through a peace process, peace negotiation between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, the oldest guerrillas that have been around for 60 years or so in an armed conflict. So that's the most, for me right now, the most important systemic event that's happening in Colombia. And so I felt the need to find my place in that system and see the patterns. So then the whole process of coming here was a learning journey for me to face and understand those patterns. So the questions that I asked myself is, what am I in the middle of? What is the journey here? What is the learning? Can I see the bigger system and find my role in the system? Can I extract some lessons that are actionable for others? So what came to me when I was thinking of that big system of the peace talks and whatnot was my stuckness, the fact that I got stuck in one moment where I got this magazine. I was subscribed to the equivalent of the Time magazine in Colombia is Semana. With a next slide, please. Oh, I have the slide thing. Must be here. It has that picture on it. And I started reading it. It talks about the 5.5 million victims from this 60-year conflict. And that was like 3-4 months ago. I started reading it, and I just had to put it down. I just didn't know what to do with that information. It was too much. And the possibility of coming here and being with you opened me up to facing the truth and facing the pain and facing the confusion and the possible understanding of what's happening. So on the plane right here, I read it. I read the magazine and read about our 60 years of war, so 4 generations of people impacted by this, 220,000 deaths between 1958 and today, 1,900 massacres. Definition of a massacre is acts of destruction where there's more than 3 homicides. 75% of this horror occurring in the last 2 decades, 5 million displaced people. There is a report called Enough Now that has more of this information. And I read part of this report. And so there's countless stories of victims of this conflict, people who lost their parents, their family members, their limbs, tons of people who have lost their limbs, their houses. So how to take this all in? So a story started to be weaved in my being when I remembered that I had listened recently to the story of this man, Father Michael Lapsley, who had come to Colombia recently, invited by an organization that I'm a member of the board. The organization that I'm a member of is called Foundation for Reconciliation, and they invited this man over. He was played a role in the anti-apartheid movement, and he received a letter which he opened, and it was a bomb, and so it exploded, and it took away both his hands and one eye and part of his hearing capacity. And so he shared his story and how he turned from freedom fighter to healer, and now he dedicates himself to work with victims, all kinds of victims and all kinds of people who suffered in the apartheid regime, and help them he creates a container, safe container for people to share their stories and find their healing. And he told his journey of recovery in such an inspiring way. It was a very tangible example of how can a victim redeem him or herself. And I thought, yeah, this is what needs to happen in my whole country. You know, this kind of story of redemption. So, you know, thinking about systems thinking, says, Peter Senge in his book says that a linear way always suggests a simple locus of responsibility. When things go wrong, this is seen as blame, she did it, or guilt, I did it. So systems thinking in its core, is not using blame, but actually seeing the whole system. And understanding that it's complex, so there's no one to blame. Here, when we talk about war, the system is, in a way, simple. There's a victim and an offender, or a victim and a victimary. And the issue with this is that if there's no healing of the victim, then he easily or she easily turns into an offender and creates more victims, so multiplies the effect. And it creates a vicious cycle of violence to future generations. So, for instance, a woman who is battered by her husband will probably batter her kids, and the kids will grow up to be battering husbands or people who abuse others in many kinds of ways. So you see the systemic importance of interrupting this cycle of violence. So there are two paths. You can either turn from victim to victimizer, or, as Father Michael Lapsley did, from victim to survivor to victor, is what he calls his journey, his path. So there's that interruption. And I think that there's a basic element here of confronting your shadow, because if we understand that we all have a shadow and we all have the potential of doing harm, then we can find that empathy with our offender. So that's where I started to see the theme, the emergent theme, the pattern that I could grab onto to understand the system and the hope to transform the system. And so there's a whole theory about forgiveness that my dear friend, the Father Leonel Narvaez from the Foundation of Reconciliation has developed, thinking about forgiveness in many, many ways. So the definition he cites in this book that I also was furiously reading on the plane, called The Revolution of Forgiveness. He says that forgiveness is the disposition to abandon your right to resentment, negative judgment, and indifferent conduct towards who offended you unjustly, cultivating instead an attitude of compassion and kindness. He has some very interesting distinctions. He says that forgiveness is an act of personal hygiene. Also, it's a way of managing ungrateful memory. And he has a whole thing about memory, turning it from static memory into dynamic memory by creating a new narrative about your past, using our right to hermeneutics. So hermeneutics, for those of you who don't know, is a current of philosophy that talks about interpretation. So how we interpret. And we have a right to interpret our past in the way we want to. Some more theory about forgiveness is that forgiveness is a political foundation, is a very important element for politics. Hannah Arendt, political philosopher, says that we have two basic political faculties. One is making and keeping promises, and the second one is forgiving. So forgiveness is a very important element of living together as a collective. Without it, systems disintegrate. So some of the steps that Leonel talks about in his book for getting at forgiveness are, first, understanding that resentment causes chaos in the system. So as we understand that, we can decide to forgive. We can then get to seeing with different eyes and open to a new narrative about our past and our future, and open our hearts to compassion. And one of the phrases that I love the most from his work is, we have to replace the irrationality of violence with the irrationality of forgiveness. Because in a way, forgiving is totally irrational when you've been the victim of any of the things that I was reading in this magazine. There's no way out in the labyrinth of your mind unless you make an existential leap, is what he calls it. An existential leap into forgiveness and compassion. So, beyond forgiveness, what is open to you is the possibility of reconciliation. And reconciliation is a social exercise to reconnect with your offender. So there are 3 steps for that, which have been seen in different countries and contexts. The truth, justice, which doesn't have to be the same punitive justice that is actually sometimes just a repetition of victim-offender, but it can be restorative justice, and then creating some kind of pact for non-repetition. And there are 3 levels of reconciliation. One is coexistence, which is just civil existing, but with some distance. Conviviality, and then the most intimate one is communion. There's a very touching story in the beginning of this book of Teresa, a victim of murder. her son was murdered in a street alley. And she went through a workshop that I'll tell you a little bit about. And she really opened up to the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. So she went to visit the man who murdered her son and started talking to him and understanding him, his life, and how he grew up in the streets and alone with no kind of acknowledgement of his humanity and his needs. And she grew in compassion and understanding for him. And you're not going to believe this, but they ended up falling in love. And they had a child. So that would be an example of communion. So this conference is called Systems Thinking in Action. So I thought I have to put in the action here, right? So I have a few slides on that, and just to give you some ideas of ways to make this operational. So Michael Lapsley, the father Michael Lapsley, whose story I was telling you about, he has an institute called the Institute for Healing of Memories. And he has a workshop that he takes people through a process that he's developed. And it has a lot to do with storytelling and acknowledging what happened and the suffering and ritual. The Foundation for Reconciliation is a very similar model based in Colombia. This is the organization that I'm a part of. And I went through their workshop called Schools of Forgiveness and Reconciliation. It's 2 weekends. One weekend is for forgiveness, and the next weekend is for reconciliation. And you can become a facilitator for this. There's some people here in the U.S. who have become facilitators, and they do this work, for their communities. It's quite profound. So then I place myself in the systems that I'm a part of at different levels, and try to see how forgiveness is playing a part in these different systems. So from global 2 all the way to the self. Let me get the iPad. So I have 1 more minute. Is that it? So I don't think I'll have time to go through all these levels. But it could be an open space talk tomorrow. So to close, I'd like to sing a song because Siraj asked me to. And the song comes from a sacred circle dance that we use at our eco-village. We use a lot of sacred circle dances, and it's called Sweep the Chambers of Your Heart. And the song reminds me of what forgiveness does to the heart and to the soul. It's like a cleansing. When you sweep yourself of that resentment, you open up to new kinds of love, deeper compassion and connectedness. Sweep the chambers of your heart. Make it ready to be the dwelling of the beloved. When you leave, love will enter. When you void of yourself, God will display His beauty.